Welcome back, everyone, to the second episode of last week's movies with me, Zane Simon. I was supposed to do this yesterday, but all of my MMA focused Conor McGregor destroying things work got in the way, so I'm doing this again on Friday. Hopefully, I can get a little time to actually do intro and outro and graphic stuff and things like that I'd like to start doing for these down the road. But at the moment, I'm still running bare bones. Uh, so hang with me if you want to, or obviously abandon it, and I'll just keep talking to myself. Uh, this week, I'm back with another 6 movies from last week because we didn't have an event that I had to cover, so I got to watch as many movies as I possibly could get myself through. Most notably from last week, I watched James Cameron's The Abyss for possibly the first time. I don't think so, but I watching it again, I couldn't remember a damn bit of it. I also watched Japanese movies, samurai drama or pseudo samurai sort of shogunate era drama called An Actor's Revenge. Classic Dave's Western, 310 to Yuma, the Hercule Poirot 1970s mystery movie Death on the Nile, Elliot Kazan's Tennessee Williams play on film Baby Doll, and the classic film noir Pushover from 1954. Starting out with The Abyss, like I say, this was kind of a weird one for me because I went in having very specific memories of seeing The Abyss as a much younger person, and then watching it, I was just like, maybe I saw like 10 minutes of this movie at some point because I had no memory of any of this. Nonetheless, it kind of falls into a lot of my other James Cameron film watching experiences, which are mostly that like, oh, this is really visually impressive, and there's some really cool stuff in here, and I don't actually really care about any of these characters. Um, Partially, I think The Abyss really suffers mostly from the idea that while a lot of the movie is focused on being a dramatic thriller and an alien exploration story, sort of an alien encounter story, the overarching narrative of the movie is really more of a big reconciliation, romantic rediscovery between Ed Harris's character and Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio. As the male and female lead, and their romantic tension is a lot of what sort of ends up driving the narrative over the bulk of it, even through crazy Marines trying to blow up aliens with nukes and all that. And it kind of lowers the stakes of the whole movie because you know that at every point those two characters kind of have to stay alive, or this whole romance arc that has been building throughout the movie just isn't going to pay off, and the movie is going to be weirdly tonally flat. And so, there's a couple of big dramatic death sequences, not to spoil too much, but you're just like, you're really going to kill somebody off? Because I don't think you can afford to, and then they don't. And added to that, too, is just kind of the fact that James Cameron really seems to love super stereotypical two-dimensional characters. So I loved the diving sequences. I loved a lot of the like underwater exploration and the sort of thrill of it. I liked the alien reveal at the end, but for a watching the director's cut a 3-hour movie, um, it's hard to see me wanting to sit down and watch all of The Abyss again. I'm going to try and do a better job with ratings because I know last time didn't make any sense. Overall, I'd say as a recommendation, I'd give it a 4 because honestly, I think that pretty much everybody should see it once, and it's pretty accessible to anyone and everyone. More personally, I'd probably give it like a 3. It's just a movie that, like, to my own tastes, I doesn't have any special pull for me beyond my love of sci-fi, and even my love of sci-fi isn't enough to overcome a lot of characters that I just don't care about at all. Afterward, watched An Actor's Revenge by Kon Ichikawa, 1963. I'm was really kind of my toe dip into Kon Ichikawa's directorial career, which I'm going to need to explore more thoroughly. He's got some other things that I'm really interested in, like 10 Dark Women, and he did a 1994 version of 47 Ronin, things like that. But really finding samurai dramas from the 60s is very much my core interest in Japanese cinema at the moment. I think that the 60s were kind of a great cinematic style, or high point for complex storytelling in Japanese cinema. A lot of what came afterward tended towards more avant-garde, more sort of less importance in narrative, and what came earlier in the 50s, a lot of it is much more basic, simplistic, very like ABC, all easy kind of cookie cutter traditional narrative. So the 60s is really this kind of nice, slightly experimental, but still sort of sticking to modern narrative conventions era in Japanese cinema. An Actor's Revenge trends a little more towards what became a lot more standard in Japanese cinema. A lot of just characters loosely introduced at different points just to kind of help the plot move. Very basic. Maybe it kind of is just caught between them. Some like the plot itself is just very basic and never really extrapolated on or explored in more depth than is ever initially offered, which is this actor who is I guess the shogunate version of drag, an actor famous for playing women who lives as somebody playing women all the time, and like he basically lives dressed up as a woman all the time, rather, even though everybody thinks of him as a man, and he has relationships with women in the movie, so he's very much in drag, and his family was ruined by these three men, and the movie starts out with him in a performance finding these three men while on stage, seeing them in the audience, and being able to enact his plan to kill them. And it's a beautifully filmed movie, great sets, great costumes, um, some really stunning singular moments, but also just kind of a boring movie that really lays out everything it's going to tell you at the beginning and then doesn't really get a lot more complicated from there. A movie I would really like to watch or to have enjoyed more than I did, but eventually I'd say probably for me it's like a 3.5, and overall the recommendation is more of a 3 because who is going to be trusted to a 60s Japanese movie. It's just not going to be in everybody's interest, basically. After that, finally found a new movie to add to my collection after a couple weeks of not finding a lot, despite the amount of stuff I've been watching, and that was the original Delmer Daves 310 to Yuma, which was just a fantastic movie. And even as somebody who I saw the remake first, the 2007, 50 years later remake of 310 to Yuma, and I enjoyed that a lot. I thought that, oh God, Russell Crowe and Christian Bale were both good in it. It had a really nice dramatic tension of action that it built along the course of the film, and the final scene where Russell Crowe gets, or where not Russell Crowe, but where Christian Bale gets gunned down and all that is very tragic, and it's a much grittier Western than the original. But this really just feels like a great kind of high style Western. Reminds me a bit of like One-Eyed Jacks, or what would be another comparable maybe The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, where you got this great music driving it and this really kind of stylish feel to the movie, where it doesn't necessarily always feel like the most authentic Western in terms of being in the Old West, but it feels like a very well crafted, emotionally on point movie. Really, Glenn Ford is fantastic in it. Really carries the whole thing. Van Heflin is great as the sort of uh, morally convicted farmer who decides that he's going to deliver Glenn Ford to justice no matter the cost. And it means that I can need to dive deeper into Delmer Davies' cinematography or cinematic discography or filmography. There we go. That's the word I was looking for. I've really only seen otherwise The Dark Passage, his early film noir, and The Hanging Tree, which is kind of an interesting Western case study of a doctor who saves a man from hanging and then tries to take over and control his whole life afterward, and really becomes a sort of overbearing force in the man's life. So I need to definitely see Jubal and maybe Broken Arrow and a few other things from Davies' filmography that I've missed to this point. After that, I watched Death on the Nile, the 1978 Hercule Poirot mystery movie starring Peter Ustinov as Poirot. I'm a huge Poirot fan, which is why I ended up seeking this out. And it was overall a really enjoyable entry in the genre. I mean, if you love Poirot, I absolutely recommend seeing it. Oh, the 310 to Yuma is a rating. I forgot. I personally would give that a 4.5 and probably recommend it at a 3.5 or 4, just as it's a black and white Western. It's not going to beat everybody's taste, but it's a really, really good movie. Exactly the kind of thing that I look for out of a classic Western. Anyway, Death on the Nile, back to that. Big Poirot fan, big Agatha Christie fan. I really like Peter. The cast in parts of this is great. Peter Ustinov, Mia Farrow, Betty Davis, Angela Lansbury, David Niven, Maggie Smith. A lot of really great, well-known actors. But it's definitely less than the sum of its parts. In part, the male lead and female lead in their main sort of relationship, I think it's I want to say it's probably Jane Birkin and John Finch, but I can't actually be sure of that. I can't just tell from the cast list, honestly. But it really, the two main central love interest actors, the victim and then the murder accomplice, are really flat and uninteresting. And there's a little too much of the movie that involves them for that to be something that this movie could easily get away with. Also, David Niven is really kind of pointless in this movie for somebody who is kind of a very debonair and sort of fun actor in lead roles. He's kind of shunted off to the straight man for Peter Ustinov, and it feels just like a waste of David Niven. And Peter Ustinov, he's good as Poirot, but it's a little weird, and he doesn't like you get the David Suchet Poirot, who's this very flamboyant, sort of dandy, extravagant figure, or you get the more recent Murder on the Orient Express. Oh man, Kenneth Branagh Poirot, who's as masculine as Poirot can be with his huge mustaches and all that. And there's this feeling that Poirot is supposed to have a ton of presence in any situation. He's supposed to be the sort of the center at the hive of whatever mysterious activity is going on. and Ustinov just kind of blends into the background. He just looks like a guy. He doesn't stand out in any way. He inhabits the role really well. He's a great actor. He doesn't have any trouble carrying it, but he doesn't. He feels very in the background of all the other drama going on, and it really allows, in that way, Angela Lansbury and Betty Davis to inhabit the forefront of the movie as these two different crazy old women that make me wish that they'd been in other movies together, because Betty Davis is playing her sort of very prototypical late career Betty Davis, like hard and unforgiving and slightly evil old lady, and Angela Lansbury is playing the very like overly sexual, dumb, and just kind of constantly out of her depth old lady in a way that gives some very fun chemistry, and where it really lends a lot to the chemistry of the movie, all told. But it's also worth noting that Angela Lansbury's part especially involves a lot of like, I don't believe it's a character from the book, and so her character involves a lot of screenwriting that is not from the Agatha Christie books, and almost all of that, any writing that was not from the books in this movie, is pretty much fails miserably and is pretty bad. So there are a few knocks against this movie that keep it from being like an overwhelming success or something. I would keep personally, for my enjoyment, it's a 4. For recommendability, it's probably a 3. It's not something that necessarily, if you're a huge Poirot fan, you should see it. It's good, it's fun, but if you're just out for more movies, it's probably not going to hit home on that many notes for you. After that, I watched the 1956 movie by Elia Kazan, Baby Doll, based on a Tennessee Williams screenplay. And it's one of several Tennessee Williams adaptations that Kazan has done. If I'm remembering properly, yeah, Streetcar Named Desire was also Tennessee Williams, and I can't remember if one of these other ones was as well. I want to say another one was, but I've seen a lot of Elia Kazan movies. I don't tend to be a big dramatic, just pure sort of melodrama fan, but Kazan's movies have generally been like, he tends to base them on very well regarded pieces of American literature. Like, you have East of Eden is based on a John Steinbeck novel, and On the Waterfront is a Bud Schulberg screenplay and a story. And he just chooses really great stories to tell. So I was really interested to see Baby Doll. My favorite of all the Elia Kazan movies I've seen so far to that point is the Bud Schulberg story. He directed A Face in the Crowd, starring Andy Griffith, about a sort of nobody jailbird who becomes an overnight radio sensation, and then a sort of political media celebrity force in a way that resonates pretty well with modern sort of celebrity discourse in America, especially when it relates to political, sort of influential political celebrities. But Baby Doll is all about this. Carl Malden is a failing cotton gin operator who sort of conned a teenage girl into marrying him with the promise that he'd be really rich and have a lot of money and support her and all that. And she's really not very well educated and really gorgeous, and has been like sort of stringing him along with the idea that by the time she turns 20, then he can have her in any way, shape, or form. But she keeps kind of going back on that because she doesn't want anything to do with this failed cotton gin operator who is just always angry and kind of abusive and depressed, and is has her kept up in a big old crumbling house that's worthless. And Eli Wallach comes around as a Italian cotton producer, and he strikes up a deal with Malden over the course of the movie, basically being like, I'm going to cuckold you, but I will steer business your way and make it so that you can support yourself and your wife again. But you have to deal with me constantly being around and doing and flirting and eventually, sort of insinuating a sexual relationship will eventually evolve. Very moving drama, but at the same time also very melodramatic. I won't lie, it kind of ends up being a bit more depressing than I would have hoped and a little less interesting than I would have hoped. Something that probably my own personal enjoyment and recommendation would line up at about a 3, just not a 3 out of 5, not something that I would really revisit. Like, it's worth seeing because it is Tennessee Williams, it is Elia Kazan, it's Eli Wallach and Carl Malden. It's great actors, written by a very good writer, directed by a very good director, but it doesn't really have a narrative. Like, there's not really a heart to the narrative. It just is kind of a sad string of events that brings these people together into a situation that is really not it just feels very sleazy and sort of un I don't know, unsavory. And there's not a lot of appeal to that, honestly, as a viewer. Like, it's an academic piece to study, but not something that you'd really want to sit down and just be like, oh, I'm gonna watch Baby Doll over again. And finally, I watched 1954 film noir starring Fred MacMurray and Kim Novak, Pushover, which is a very solid by the numbers film noir, a cop who gets in over his head, falling for a mobster's girlfriend that he's supposed to be watching, and he ends up in love with her and willing to, break all the bounds of his job as a police officer and all that, and to get in deep and really kind of put himself out in danger for her. And it's not bad. It's well acted. It's decently written. It's fun little film noir crime movie. It doesn't really. A lot of the supporting characters aren't that good or interesting. Uh, his his sidekick in the movie that he's held up with, I think it's played by Rick McAllister, and his love interest Dorothy Malone, their relationship and the sort of offshoots of that story really don't feel very interesting or like they add a whole lot to the film. And so there's really it's kind of a very decent noir spread out very thin, where you get a lot of good moments between MacMurray and Novak, buttressed by a lot of boring stuff that you just don't care about at all. And all of which makes for a movie that, it's worth seeing if you want another film noir to watch. It was like a 3.5 for me, probably a 3 for most people, just not something that people are gonna flock to unless you're a big fan of film noir, but there's nothing wrong with it in terms of another film noir to watch. That wraps up everything I've seen for this week. Next week, I will be talking about uh let's see, 13 Assassins, The Furies, The Offense, and I've forgotten the other thing. What was it now? Oh yeah, People Will Talk. So, and I'm probably also going to go see Death of Stalin. So I'll talk about Death of Stalin as well. That's probably the most notable thing for the next week that I'll be doing for my show. So until then, give the video a like. That's the thumbs up thing down there. Subscribe to my YouTube channel if you want, if you're interested in more of this. I'll be working on getting a more improved graphic and sound design and stuff like that as I go, maybe, hopefully. And thanks everyone for tuning in. Find me on Twitter at Zane Simon, and I'll see you next time.